Good morning, everyone. Good morning. All right, that's better. I want to talk about data this morning, and in particular, this phenomenon of big data. Now, if you want to mentally swap out the word content every time No, my mic's on, it's just upside down. So clearly, you all should be listening carefully when I talk about technology. You don't have an alternative except to listen closely because my mic is upside down. All right, let me try this again. Assuming I have any credibility left whatsoever, what I'd like to do is talk about data. And as I say that word, if you want to mentally swap out data and put in content, that's fine. All I want to talk about is this phenomenon of more and more of the world's information being available in digital form. Some of that's numeric, we tend to call that data. Some of it's textual, we tend to call that content. Forget about that distinction. I just want to talk about this amazing phenomenon of ridiculous amounts of information for the first time being available in digital form and what that means for the business world. With my colleague, Eric Brynjolfsson, and after working with the guy for 15 years, I can now pronounce his last name. Do not try it at home. Eric and I wrote an article that came out a little over a year ago in HBR called Big Data, the Management Revolution. What I learned is that when you write for HBR, what you do is you just you fill in this blank field, and then they substitute the management revolution afterward. Because about 3/4 of the articles that appear in the magazine are about the next management revolution. Here's the one that we're interested in. Eric and I are both fairly geeky guys. I'm going to use the word geek about 300 times this morning. It is a term of praise when I use it. So I think this audience, some of us might self-identify as geeks. I'm with you, and then this is fantastic. So we tend to write about things what the geek world is doing to the world of suits. In other words, how technological changes the business world, changes how companies perform, compete, organize themselves, whatnot. We wrote this article a little over a year ago in HBR, and I've never had this happen with anything else that I've written for the magazine. As soon as it appeared, my phone started to ring. And you realize that's a euphemism. Nobody's phone actually rings anymore. But people started to manifest themselves, and in particular, a lot of executive teams, a lot of the leaders of organizations, all different sizes, all different parts of the world, reached out and said, can you help us understand what this big data thingy is and why we should be interested and what we should do about it? So I've had this fantastic experience over the past year of spending a lot of time with executive teams of companies, helping them understand this world of big data. And I noticed that the same 3 questions keep coming up just about uniformly when you talk about this phenomenon. The companies who are aware enough to be interested tend to ask the same 3 questions over and over. So what I'd like to do this morning is walk through what those 3 questions are and my answers to them. The first one is a question that you'd expect right away is how much data are we talking about? Companies say with a lot of justification, look, we've had data as long as I've been around. We've had technologies to help us with it as long as I've been around. We know we have a lot of content and that there are good nuggets down in there. So why are you hanging this word big in front of data now? Exactly how much data, how much content are we talking about? Everyone has their own favorite way to answer this question. Mine is by looking back in history and walking through a progression that I find really interesting. So here's my answer for why, how much data and how big is this big data explosion. On or about 1980, there was a company founded called Teradata. And they chose the name of this company deliberately. They chose the prefix as a shorthand for unimaginably large amounts of data. And the value proposition of Teradata way back in 1980 was, world, we will help you manage these unbelievably large amounts of data that you're confronting. And that prefix Tera tried to capture that crazy bigness of the data back then. What's interesting to me is that prefix worked for about 28 years as a way to convey unimaginably large amounts of data. That worked until about 2008 when I read in Wired magazine that we had entered the petabyte age. And you start to notice this phenomenon of prefix creep going on. Tera didn't work anymore. We're now in the petabyte age. That prefix worked not for 28 years, but for about 4 years when Wired revisited the phenomenon and said, nope, it's not the petabyte age anymore. We're now in the exabyte revolution. So, you all go back and grab your metric system textbooks and try to keep up with what's going on. This prefix worked not for 28 years, not for 4 years. This prefix worked for about 6 months. By the end of 2012, I got a report from Cisco. They looked at all the traffic across their routers and said that we were now in the zettabyte era. I don't want to alarm anybody here, but we have a problem. We are about to run out of metric system. I'm not making this up. Here's where we are right now. This is the zettabyte era. We have one left. There's this thing called the yada, and after that, it's unknown territory, man. What's amazing to me is they brought the metric system geeks together. Can you imagine a geekier conference than the metric system conference? They brought these guys together for the last time in 1991, and I've got this vision of this room full of, high-energy physicists and interstellar astronomers and people used to dealing with extremely big numbers. And the discussion was, how big a number are we ever going to need and what prefix should we hang on it? And all these people were saying, yeah, okay, 10 to the 24th is crazy big. That's the most we'll ever need. Let's call it some silly thing like a yada. What is seriously fascinating to me is we are bumping up against that now. Not because of higher energy physics or interstellar distances, because of the volume of digital data out there in the world. So like you can imagine, the digital geeks are on top of this phenomenon. They have formed a working group. I'm not making this up. They have petitioned the metric system geeks for how to expand the system. The leading candidate right now is the hella as a prefix. This is straight up. I actually told this as a joke a few times. I got an email from the guy who wrote the email to the metric system people proposing hella as the next. He was like, no, that's actually not a joke. That's what we're trying to do here. So the point is, when you look at the volume of data, this explosion is absolutely real. It is outstripping our ability to describe what's going on. This is an amazing phenomenon. If we spent any time here, we know that in addition to volume, there are two other V's. There's the velocity. We all know the data is coming at us with unbelievable speed. No matter what kind of data or content you're interested in, there is a fire hose of it coming at you all the time. And then the third V is the fact that our data are not behaving well anymore. They're not showing up in nice official documents. They're not showing up in rows and columns and transactional databases that we've been very, very accustomed to working with. They're coming from crazy new forms of social media. This is wild and woolly and unstructured data. A lot of it is textual. We're getting it from searches and from weird things like URL shorteners. And I'll give you an example of how much insight we can glean from this volume of search data that's coming around the world. There's 1 point something or other billion Google searches per day. What's even more interesting to me is evidently about 500 million of those every day have never been seen before by Google. The novelty out there is staggering. The continual novelty is staggering, and there's real insight to be gained from that. These things that we all carry around spit out an exhaust trail of data. That has a GPS on it, a Wi-Fi sensor, a cell phone signal, a compass, an accelerator. These things are data generators. My colleagues who study biology and genomics these days look at all of that and say, isn't that cute, what you all are doing with your little data. Their point is that the volume of data that's going to be generated by the genomics revolution, by the intersection of information technology and genetics, is going to dwarf everything else that we're talking about. They say the technologies that we have are staggeringly inadequate for the amount of genomic data that's coming at us. We sequenced the human genome for the first time completely 10 years ago, 2003, at a cost of about $2.7 billion. Any of us can go get a complete genome sequenced for well under $10,000 these days. And a little while back, I spit into a test tube and mailed it off to 23andMe. And for less than $100, I got a pretty decent individualized genetic sequence telling me where I came from and what I need, I need to watch my cholesterol and stuff, duh. But I learned some interesting, for $99, this cost over about $3 billion 10 years. The declines, all three of the V's are staggering us these days. So I try to make that point to the organizations that get in touch and are interested in this big data phenomenon. And if you can convince them that there really is something new going on here, that this prefix big is not just marketing hype, that it really does mean something, then the second question comes up, which is, all right, so what? What does this mean for us? I'm not running a biology company. I'm not running a consumer web company most of the time. I'm not trying to run Google or Facebook. So I don't feel like I'm a big data organization. My corner of the business world doesn't feel like it's going to be susceptible or deeply influenced by this revolution that you're talking about. Help me understand, what does this mean for me? The point that Eric and I tried to make in our article was basically, we don't care what industry you're in, what geography you're in, what role or function you're fulfilling. Big data is relevant to you for the pretty simple reason that we're very confident that no matter what you do, there is now a large volume of relevant information available to you in digital form. This is how academics sound when they try to express themselves clearly. You need to turn it over to the big data geeks themselves, who usually have a much more pithy, kind of impactful way to describe why people should care about this. Here's my favorite quote about big data. The world is one big data problem. Now, this is a really arrogant claim coming from the big data community. We don't care what we don't know, we don't care whatever you're doing, it is a big data problem. I want to give you 4 examples that show how much truth there is to this quote, and how actually I think it might be something close to a statement of fact about the world today. I want to skip across 4 very different companies, 4 very different industries, and 4 very different problem or opportunity areas, and just give kind of a quick hopscotch tour of how big data is changing the world these days. The first area that I want to look at is prediction or forecasting, or having a better crystal ball for your corner of the world. We would all, I don't care what we do, we would all like a better crystal ball about what's coming, what the future holds for us. This is certainly true in anything having to do with the real estate or the housing market. You would love to know if you build bricks for a living, if you're in the lumber industry, if you're a contractor, if you're a home, I don't care. You would love a decent quality prediction about how housing prices are going to be changing, ideally, metropolitan area by metropolitan area in the country. This is the status quo method for how you do it. The National Association of Realtors generates a forward-looking projection about real estate price changes area by area throughout the country, and they do it in the time-honored way of grabbing a bunch of hopefully relevant economic indicators. What are interest rates like? What are currency exchange rates like? What's GDP growth like? They grab all these things that are hopefully, gauges on the dial of the housing market. They build them into a statistical model, and they generate a forecast for how housing prices are going to change. My co-author, Eric, and his doctoral student, Lin Wu, a little while back, had an insight about how to do it really, really differently. They said, wait a minute, if someone is going to move to the Boston area, what they're not going to do is just pack up the truck one day and start driving northeast. That's not how it works. What they do instead is, probably a few months in advance of a move, they start doing research. And the way you do research these days is by typing the first 3 or 4 words that occur to you into a white box in a search engine. So before I move to Boston, I'm going to start typing things like Boston school districts or Boston 2-bedroom house prices or Boston real estate agent, stuff like that into Google. And their thought was maybe in aggregate, those kinds of search queries, the relative volume of those kinds of search queries, is going to give us a decent indication of how housing prices are going to change. If the volume goes up, housing prices rise. If the volume goes down, housing prices fall. Pretty straightforward. Eric called up his buddies at Google and said, hey, can I have some data about your search volumes for these kinds of queries related to housing price changes? Can I have some kind of API or a backdoor pipe to get this stuff from you guys? And they said, no. You can do what everybody else does, which is get it for free. They said, Eric, here's a URL. We make this information available to the public. You don't put down the phone and go to this URL. You can grab the data that you need. So he and Lynn did this. They built a very simple model. The other thing to keep in mind, neither of them knows anything about the housing market. Neither of them is a real estate economist. Such things exist. They're not one of them. And all they had was this insight that search volumes might be predictive somehow. So they built a relatively simple model. They calibrated it with historical data, and then they did a test for a while. And what they learned is that their model was, on average, about 23.6% better than the National Association of Realtors' gold standard baseline model for predicting housing price changes. So if you take this very different approach, if you try to tap into this big data fire hose, even though any particular piece of that data is going to be very low quality and the signal is very messy, there is still great insight, great volume to be extracted from that torrent of information out there. The second area I want to look at is running an operation, trying to stay on top of a far-flung operation and make it run better. And the operation I want to look at in this case is casual dining table service restaurants. So think about a Chili's or an Applebee's or a Fridays or something like that. If you run one of these, two things are pretty apparent to you. First of all, in a modern table service restaurant, you're sitting on a huge amount of very low-level transactional data. All these restaurants by now have point-of-sale systems, and everyone that works for you has to use them to get anything done, to order a meal from the kitchen, to print a check, to pay a bill, to split it. Anything you want to do is initiated via these point-of-sale systems. The other thing that you know if you run one of these is that one of the single biggest challenges you face and one of the single biggest drains on your profit, there's not really a polite way to say this, is that your employees steal from you. And there's lots of different ways for money to walk out the door. It's amazing how devious people are when instead of actually doing their job better, they find ways to rip off their employer. So a constant headache. And if you talk to anybody who's managed one of these restaurants, they're all aware of it. But because they're such busy, chaotic environments, it's really hard to watch everybody like a hawk and let them know that you are watching them. Some innovators a while back realized that the first of those phenomena, the fact that there is incredibly detailed low-level data, might help with the second one, the fact that people tend to steal from you. And they built an analytic tool that sits on top of this mass, this fire hose of low-level data from restaurants, and spits out alerts when they see suspicious activity. So they've got this pattern matching set of algorithms set up, and the people who run restaurants start getting alerts if something suspicious is going on in their location. So two colleagues, Lamar Pierce, Dan Snow, and I, looked at what happened across about 400 different locations, both before and after this new technology went in place. We got to observe the before and after performance. The first thing we learned is that across these locations, observed theft went down by about $25 per week on average. Not blowing anybody away, right? You'd rather have the $25 back in your pocket, but this is not going to make a material difference in the performance of these sites. The crazy thing that we observe, though, is that weekly sales, total weekly sales went up by about $3,000 a week on average across these locations. And you go, huh? It doesn't make any sense. And until you start to put the picture together that what might be happening is people reallocating their effort away from being devious and toward doing the right thing in the eyes of the people who own the restaurant, in the eyes of the manager. And so we think that's what explains this is a significant jump in weekly revenue, especially when you think that it's basically all just flowing to the bottom line. This is all just profit going back into the location. The other thing we observe that's even weirder to us is that tip percentage went up significantly after this technology went in place. So it doesn't even look like it's a story about disgruntled employees and Big Brother watching them. It seems to be a story about employees hustling, doing their jobs better, taking better care of customers, and getting rewarded better, having their tips go up as a result. So this shows us that when you're trying to stay on top of a really busy, far-flung operation, technology and data can be your best friend in doing that. The third area I want to look at is this constant war that we have for talent. How are you going to identify the best people to bring into your organization? How are you going to retain them? How are you going to manage their careers? This is what keeps almost every manager that I know up at night. How do we find and keep the best people? You might have heard that Google has thought that they were fantastic at this since the company was founded. And in particular, they prided themselves on this really rigorous, really kind of, forgive the term, hard-ass interview process that Google had, where they would bring in employees and they'd kind of barrage them with brain teaser questions. So they'd do things like they'd sit the kid down who just came out of Carnegie Mellon, and they'd say, all right, a chicken and a half can lay an egg and a half in a day and a half. How many eggs can a chicken lay in a day? Go. And they'd watch this kid try to work through the problem, and they would think that was indicative of the quality of mind that they were dealing with and a good way to assess whether they should hire the guy or not. So this was an interview I came across in the Times a while back with the head of people at Google, and he said something really interesting. He said, a while back, we decided to test whether that was working or not. It was an article of faith in our company that this brain teasery, barrage you with questions approach to interviewing was the right way to identify talent. We tried to test that with the data. It turns out when you do that, there is no correlation between how well someone performs on these silly brain teaser kinds of questions in an interview and how good their career is at Google afterward. So this whole thing where you sit somebody down and say, how many gas stations in Manhattan, how would you figure that out, meant nothing for the company. And they had to substantially rethink their human capital practices, their talent management practices, because the data were telling them that what they were doing wasn't working. I'll come back to what they've switched over to because it's absolutely fascinating. But this is a company that was insightful enough to use the data to challenge some deeply held, some ingrained beliefs about people and about how to find people, and got an unpleasant surprise as a result. The last story I want to tell is about troubleshooting or root cause analysis. Something has changed, something has gone wrong, and we need to figure out what the heck it is. And the example I'm going to use is unfortunately a tragic one. It's about the cholera epidemic that happened in Haiti after that earthquake in 2010. So in 2010, there was the devastating earthquake in Haiti. The insult to injury was in the wake of it, they had a cholera outbreak. Terrible disease, very contagious. Haiti had no previous experience with the disease, very ill prepared to deal with it. And at one point, about 6% of the population had come down with cholera. This is horrible. One of the things you really have to do is trace it back, identify where it started, shut it off at the source, in addition to trying to treat the people who are already suffering from the disease. Two super interesting parts about the troubleshooting story here. The first one is their best tool for tracking the disease back to its source and tracking the spread of the disease turns out to have been Twitter. So compared to other things they could do, like put people in Jeeps and drive them around the country and do interviews and send the World Health Organization volunteers out around the country, that probably was helpful. What was more helpful was just tracking tweets about Haiti and cholera. Think how amazing this is. It's not like the telecommunications infrastructure in Haiti was in great shape after they had a devastating earthquake. So it's amazing to me that Twitter was still such a powerful tool for tracing it back to its source. When they did this, they came to one hypothesis, which was that the disease started at the camp of a bunch of Nepalese UN peacekeepers who had been sent there to help with earthquake recovery. Nepal did have a history of cholera. Haiti never did. But you can imagine when someone voiced this idea, how Nepal reacted to it, how the United Nations reacted to it. There was a whole lot of heck no, our practices, our sanitary practices are good. This clearly was not our fault. That discussion ended when they did a genetic analysis of the cholera strain that was in Haiti and found that it was a perfect match for the pre-existing strain that had come from Nepal. So this is a wonderful way to shut down the debate and stop the blame game and the not me problem. When you have access to this kind of data, you can end the discussion very, very quickly. This is an amazing story to me because it combines two very, very different kinds of data. This formless, texty, socially generated data, and this incredibly rigorous quantitative comes right out of the DNA molecule kind of data. You bring these two together and you start to get insights on very tough troubleshooting root cause analysis problems. I find that if I can tell enough different stories like this, you can get an executive team excited about the phenomenon, hopefully convinced that they themselves are a big data organization, or at least one that would benefit from taking some different approaches. And then the third question comes up, which is, well, okay, fine, we're excited. What is going to be difficult for us? Where are the challenges going to come as we try to become a big data organization? And as we all know, there is no shortage of challenges as you try to become more content-friendly, more data-friendly, a more rigorous or data-driven organization. There are tons of challenges. You have to get your technology right, which is why we're all here today. Luckily, Alfresco and their peers in the industry are doing a great job rolling out technologies to help us keep up with this deluge that we're facing. You have to upgrade the skills of your people. This is a strange new world. A lot of our current legacy training needs to be revisited. There are tons of challenges. The one that I keep my eye on, and the one that I honestly think is the biggest deal, is the prevalence of hippos in the business world today. Any of us heard this acronym before? Hands way up, way up. A few of us have. This is my new favorite business acronym. It stands for highest paid person's opinion. And it is how most companies make most of their most important decisions these days. I'm serious. So you've got a challenge, you've got a problem, and you bring a team together. That team might include some data-driven geeks, some analytic folk, and they present their points of view, their findings, to the alleged smart person at the top of the org chart or the expensive consultant that got brought in. And the hippo takes in all these different inputs, maybe including the data and the conclusions from the analytic team. And then the hippo pronounces upon the situation and says, okay, gang, we're going to head down this path, not this path. We're going to do A, not B or C. And I make that call. I make that tough call out of my gut, hippos have big guts, right? Out of my judgment, out of my intuition, my experience, my expertise, my glittering resume, my track record, this stuff that I have built up over a career spanning, very often several decades. That is what has prepared me to make the tough calls for this organization, and that's why you're going to listen to me when it comes time to make a call. Very common, call it, hippo, pundit, expert, whatever, prevalent style of decision making in organizations. It's not data free, but data is one input to the hippo's decision-making process. I want to contrast the hippo style of decision-making with what I would call the pure geek style, which is full-on, I'm going where the data take me. I am not second-guessing the data. The data are not one input to the process. The data and the conclusions from it are the process, and at that point, we're going to shut up and follow the data. These are two very different approaches to making a decision or a judgment in an organization. And I want to show some information about what happens when we have head-to-head comparisons, head-to-head competitions between the hippos and the geeks. To do that, stupid question time. How many of us are into wine at all? How many of us have heard of a guy named Robert Parker? Robert Parker, pictured here with sniffing, has been called the most influential critic in the world. For many years, he published a newsletter called The Wine Advocate, and he was the guy that popularized the 91, 92, 93 scoring system for a glass of wine. So when you walk into the liquor store, you've got no idea what you're doing. You see, this one's a 93. You're like, oh, that's fantastic. And this one over here is a 91. And if you went to Robert Parker and you said, hey, Robert, why was that one a 93 and that one a 91? He'd say, because that one was two better. In other words, I'm going to use my hippo talent, my palate, this very refined palate. I've been drinking wine for 40 years or something. I'm going to use the skills, the palate, the whatever I've built up over that time to make a subjective call about the quality of this wine, because there is no other way to do it. There is certainly no better way to do it than relying on the palate of me and the other hippos out there. If you know anything about wine, probably the toughest call to make in the entire world of wine is drinking brand new Bordeaux wines and figuring out how good they're going to be 15, 20 years down the road when they're ready to drink. These wines take forever to mature. You throw them in oak casks and let this aging process happen. After 20 years of these magnificent, great wines of the world, when they're first pressed, they taste horrible. None of us would want to drink them, but you have to be able to make a call right at the time of harvest, right at the time of pressing, to know how much you should be willing to pay for this vile liquid, because 20 years down the road, it's going to be an investment quality wine if we've done our work right. It's going to be one of the great wines on the planet. It is the classic hippo tough call, because the hippos fly into Bordeaux, they all sniff, they drink this plonk, they spit it out, and they say, this is going to be, 20 years from now, this is going to be fantastic, or don't bother, this one's going to stink. A little while back, a geek took a look at this and said, no, I'm taking a very different approach here. He was a guy named Orley Ashenfelter, which is one of the great geek names of all time. You know this guy is going to approach it with numbers. An economist at Princeton, he liked wine, but he said, no, the truth about wine, including the great wines of Bordeaux, the truth about wine is in the numbers. And he made this statement that was complete heresy in the wine world. He said, wine is an agricultural product. In particular, Bordeaux wine, the geography doesn't change. The French government fixed the areas in the mid-19th century. The geography doesn't change. The grape doesn't change. You can't swap out grapes willy-nilly in Bordeaux if you want to call it Bordeaux. Ashenfelter said the only thing that changes, therefore, is the weather. So what I'm going to do is grab a bunch of historic data about the weather in Bordeaux. I'm going to correlate that against the eventual auction prices, the prices that we paid for these wines once they were mature. And I'm going to build, again, a very simple data-driven model to predict the quality of Bordeaux wine. You can imagine what Parker and the other hippos of the wine world thought of this. Parker called it ludicrous and absurd to approach it this way. Things did not get any better when Ashenfelter published his results, because if you want to know the quality of the great wines on the planet, that's it, kids. First of all, it's an equation. Second of all, he said, give me 3 bits of publicly available information. 3 bits. If you tell me winter rainfall, which is good, growing season temperature, which needs to be high, and then harvest rainfall is bad, so I'm going to put a negative sign on that. You tell me 3 things, I will tell you the eventual price and hence quality of the great wines of the planet. Can you imagine how this went over in the wine world? Parker said this is like reviewing a movie without going to see it first. So he got laughed out of the room. In particular, he got laughed out of the room because Ashenfelter started making his predictions in 1989 and 1990. And he said at that time, both of these are going to be among the great Bordeaux wines of the century. So he didn't go out with a middle-of-the-road prediction. He went out and said, these are stratospherically good wines. It turns out he was exactly correct. Both of those have been among the great wines of the century. His numbers have held up equally well since then. And in the wine world now, it's still fashionable to poo-poo this geeky approach in public. But in private, when it comes time to buy a case of wine or not, you go with the geeks on this one. I love this because it's such a clear head-to-head comparison of the hippo style versus the geek style. We had another great head-to-head comparison last year during the US presidential election when geek hero Nate Silver was running a data-driven prediction about the election on the New York Times website. You can imagine what the hippos of the political world thought of this as well. This is what a hippo does classically. This is a guy named Michael Barron. My political science colleagues tell me this guy actually knows his stuff. He's very well regarded when it comes to issues of the American electoral system and our elections. And shortly before the election, he took a classic hippo approach to predicting what was going to happen. He ran his eyes down the list of swing states. He compared that to what he knew about the voters in Pennsylvania versus Florida versus North Carolina and everything. And he said, bottom line, Romney 315, Obama 223. A bit of fundamentals. In other words, this election is about fundamentals. I, as a US political system hippo, know the fundamentals of elections better than a geek in some windowless room with computers and data, better than that geek could ever understand the situation. Because after all, here's another great hippo quote about elections from David Brooks. If there's one thing we know, it's that even experts with fancy computer models are terrible at predicting human behavior. This is exactly what Nate Silver was trying to do. He drew pictures that look like this, where every day during the election campaign, he would update these two lines of his latest information from polls. The important thing to keep in mind, Silver did not go out and do focus groups. He didn't go walk around Florida and Pennsylvania and Ohio and the other swing states. He just grabbed, again, publicly available polling data and cranked it day after day with his statistical toolkit. So he would draw these pictures, and shortly before the election, he said, man, I think Obama's got a 90.9% chance of winning, and Romney has a 9.1% chance. Those two numbers add up to 100. Somebody's got to win, and there was no third-party candidate, and he would draw these lines throughout the season. What you notice is that Silver was saying from the get-go, this election is not close. Now, this election is close in terms of the popular vote. It was actually a pretty razor-thin election. But in the Electoral College, Obama has an edge. He maintained that edge, and all throughout the season, that edge was there, and it was pretty significant. So what Silver and the other geeks were saying is this election is close, but it's not even close. And you can think of how the hippo class responded to this. These are the people that we have to put up with on all the cable news shows all the damn time for months on end before we finally elect somebody. And they say things like this. This is Morning Joe, former US Congressman himself. He said, fundamentally misunderstanding what Silver was saying with that 90.9. He said, anyone that thinks this race is anything but a toss-up right now should be kept away from computers and laptops and microphones because they're a joke. Huge problem for Morning Joe and Michael Barron and everybody else was that Silver and the other quants got the election exactly right. They called all 50 states correctly. They got the Electoral College exactly right. They even got right which they were less certain about the states that wound up being having the thinnest margins of victory. It was basically a perfect data-driven prediction about a very chaotic situation in a world full of hippos, most of whom, basically all of whom, got it deeply wrong one way or another. So I was keeping track of these head-to-head competitions between the geeks and the hippos, and the geeks kept winning, and I kept on going rock on. But then I thought, wait a minute, as a self-identified geek, you are probably biased here. You're not being objective yourself. Shame on you. You need to be more systematic and objective about this head-to-head competition. And so I was thinking about how to do that. It turns out I didn't have to because this research team had already done it. This is a fantastic paper where these guys found 136 head-to-head competitions between geeks and pundits, hippos, experts, whatever, on the other side. Amazing to me, this was published before the era of big data. So this is back in the small data era. How were the geeks doing against the hippos, even before the geek toolkit got so much better in the big data era? They broke down their results, these 136 studies, into 3 buckets. Toss-up, no significant difference. Cases where the experts were clearly better, and cases where the data-driven, the purely data-driven approach was clearly better. Biggest category was the toss-up. In 48% of the cases, there was no significant difference between what the geek came up with and what the alleged expert came up with. Second biggest, almost as big, in 46% of the cases, the purely data-driven approach did a significantly better job than the alleged expert in the area. These were studies in areas that we care a lot about. What medical condition does this patient have? Which of these students will succeed at school? Which of these criminals will commit a crime if we let them out on parole? We care about this stuff. The experts were batting about 0.059 across these 136 studies. So when you take a more objective and systematic look, your faith in geekery gets even stronger going forward. And I wonder why we should listen to these alleged experts at all if their track record is so lousy. It is a big, deep question going forward for the world of business. Which brings up a little bit of a fourth question, and one that usually someone asks me in a hallway when we're done with this kind of session. He goes, what am I supposed to do for a living now? If I got a few years left in my career, help me out here. What I'm not saying is that experts should be banished and they should all be fired and we need to have expert-free organizations. That's not the case at all. There are 2 really important roles for experts, traditional experts, in the organizations of today and tomorrow. The first one is to figure out what we should be working on next. I have never seen a computer that could figure out where the next great opportunity was, what the next challenge was that we needed to tackle, how to prioritize the work of the organization, how to spot something and go after it. Computers can't do that yet. Picasso, of all people, had an amazing quote early in the era of computers. He looked at them and said, "But they're useless. They can only give you answers." He was exactly half right. They're not useless. They're astonishingly powerful tools. They still give answers. They don't know what questions to ask. Those of us who have spent a long time in a situation know what question to go ask. The second thing is we still want experts' opinions, but we want them in a really particular way. We want them as one input to a data-driven decision-making process. That's the opposite of what we typically do right now, where like I said, the geeks do their work, they feed their work to the hippo, and the hippo goes, okay, I'll weight that somehow in my hippo-based decision process. This is exactly backward. This is precisely backward. What we should do instead is say to the experts, say to the hippos out there, hey, tell us what you think. We want your opinion. We're going to quantify it and bake it into our algorithm, and that will help us with our predictive power eventually. Turns out this is exactly what Google is doing these days in their hiring processes. They do relatively structured interviews right now instead of these silly brain teaser interviews. And at the end, they say to the interviewer, what did you think of Andy's energy, of his curiosity, of his ability to think through a problem? Rate it 1 to 5. That turns out to be a good way, very predictive of how someone does on the job, as opposed to this silly, I'm going to sit across from you and look in your eye and watch you solve a problem, and I'm going to decide to hire you or not. That's a completely backward approach. Last thing before we throw this open, because I'd love to hear questions and what people want to talk about, let me draw a silly picture about what the future of making decisions in organizations is going to look like. And I want to use 2 axes. First is how much data are we using in this decision-making process? And I'm going to make that scale exponential because the data volumes are going up so quickly. And the other axis is what is our decision-making style? Are we data-dominated or are we hippo-dominated? I assert, as a hippo in this field, that most of us are right here, right now. We're not using crazy volumes of data, and our decision processes are still very hippo-dominated. I tell you with all the confidence in the world, this is the path for success going forward. up the volumes of data that you're using, the content that you're using, tap into the big data world, and try to transition your organization from Hippo-dominated to data-dominated. Over time, good decisions add up. They start to steamroll bad ones, and the organizations that make good, smart decisions going forward are the ones that are going to pull ahead of the competition. Let me stop there. We have microphones. I would love to hear questions in reaction to all of this. Would our mic people please gesticulate frantically so I know where you are? Gesticulate frantic. This is not frantic enough. Okay, that's frantic. Okay, and if you have a question, could you also please spaz out a little bit so our mic people know where to go? We have a question up front? Can you wait for a microphone, please?
I think the word data means given, and it seems to me that a lot of what hippos do is try to prevent people from having data. So I'm wondering...
You have a cynical view of organizations, sir.
Do you have a model for how data is hidden and also how it's corrupted in organizations?
I take your point. Very often, old-style hippos see their role as gatekeeping in organizations and kind of being a valve for data, for decisions, for communication, for all that stuff. That's a business we need to get out of. And increasingly, it's easy to find end runs around those people in this very data-rich world that we live in. If you're surrounded by that many classic old-style bureaucrats and gatekeepers, I'd say go find a more friendly environment for data and for geeks. I assure you that they're out there. I was either that clear or that boring. I'm going to go with the former, I think. Up front here? Yeah, please. I think when the founder wants to ask a question, we kind of have to let him, and then compliment him on what a brilliant question it was, right?
I think the hippo's over there. I love the fact you brought up Nate Silver.
Okay.
And he's gone out of politics into sports.
Yep.
And so, I guess the highest bidder is going to win for the people who can take and use these types of approaches and whatever. How do we get, these data-driven systems to solve the important problems? And I'll probably get booed out of here, but I don't think sports is the most important problem to solve.
Boo.
Yeah, but
that was
it is Boston.
Yeah, exactly. Be careful here, friend. That was a brilliant question up until you blew it at the end.
Yeah, right. Yeah. No, but I was really sad that Nate had left politics with with all the stuff that was going on in Congress and the budget and stuff like that. So,
and I hope so that we're bringing up the fact that Nate took this sweet deal to go work for ABC. Is that who hired him? ESPN, ABC, to go do different kinds of prediction. He just wants data-rich sandboxes to do his predicting. And two of the big ones are sports, and there's a big audience for it, and then also the Oscar race every year. He wants to handicap that as well. So we can think of those as kind of silly or trivial. I am very confident that when the next elections roll around, when 2016 comes around, Nate and his team will be back making predictions there. But you bring up this point, are the geeks focused on the world changing, the really important areas, or are they not? One of the founders of Cloudera is a guy named Jeff Hammerbacher who had this wonderful quote a while back. He said, "The best minds of my generation are out in Silicon Valley trying to figure out how to get people to click on ads." I think that's a terrible shame. If that were true, I would find it a terrible shame as well. But when I look around, I do see the geeks applying their energies to some of the areas that we've talked about, some really, really important areas like improving human health, like making organizations run better, like figuring out how to intervene effectively in some situations. And I think it's a combination of the old-style experts who honestly know the big problems that we should be tackling. If you let a bunch of 23-year-olds find their own problems, they're just going to do fantasy football, right? We know that. I think they need some guidance from their elders about these actually are the important problems to work on. Then unleash the geek army on those, and we're going to get very good results.
We have. Just talk Okay, we have seen a precedent, though, where Wall Street goes and buys up physicists and chemists and whatever because of their data capabilities.
Yep.
So.
Yep, and you know, Wall Street talks very, very loud. This is a market working. I think it's a perversion of the market instead of healthy market functioning. And I would love to figure out what we can do so that the smartest kids that I teach and that I see don't want to go off and stare at spreadsheets for a hedge fund for 80 hours a week. I think that's a waste of talent. What I will tell you is in this environment, a lot of the smartest young people that I know are really interested in getting into the tech world, not on Wall Street, and you know, changing the world. So you can be either discouraged by Wall Street or encouraged by the rest of what the geeks are doing. I try to focus on the positive.
I don't know, finding a good red wine could be world changing. Have you found in your lecture circuit some industries you find that are better at using data than others?
Yeah, the tech industries are usually pretty good at being data-driven. The Google example shows that even in these incredibly geek-heavy, quantitatively oriented companies, they're still making fundamental errors, fundamental hippo-style errors. In general, tech is pretty good. After that, it drops off kind of quickly, but you see these pockets of excellence in industry after industry. One of my business heroes is Gary Loveman, the guy that runs Caesars Entertainment, who brought a very data-driven, very geeky style to managing a company in the gaming industry, you know, dominated by pit bosses historically, and he has brought a very rigorous style of management to that company in that industry. So we see pockets of excellence everywhere, but right now they're the exception instead of the rule, which implies massive opportunity for people out there. Second row, sir, yep.
I was recently brought into an organization with some hippos in it. They want to succeed, but hippos are big and they don't really want to move.
Yeah.
I would like to hear some success stories and how do you get a big hippo to move and be glad about it?
Those are two very different questions, right? This, I think, is the fundamental difficulty, which is that even if you can convince the hippos of this opportunity, for a lot of reasons, they prefer to remain where they are. They have like you point out, they have a lot of mass, they have a lot of inertia, they usually have a lot of power in the organization, and getting them and the organization to shift is hard, slow work. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It is a long, constant battle. It's the classic tugboat turning an ocean liner. It's just not going to happen quickly. What I've learned is that the best way to convince them is to triangulate with three kinds of argument. First of all, tell case studies, tell examples like we're seeing. That matters. Second of all, show data, show those 136 studies head to head. And then third, give them a theory, give them a reason give them a way to think, a framework to think about what's going on. Clay Christensen is probably somebody that a lot of people in this room have read or follow. One of the things Clay taught me was what we academics very often do is disguise our theories and say, you know, don't worry, just do what I tell you. What Clay taught me is that managers, people running organizations, are voracious consumers of a theory. They want a way to think about the world. So if I can try to combine really good case studies and anecdotes with data, with a theory, and the theory that I use is about how we humans are really, our brains are amazing, but they've got these biases and flaws in them. We need to use data as a check against that kind of stuff. If I can triangulate with data, vivid examples, and theory, over time, the hippos are going to move eventually. I guess the fourth dimension is fear of competition, because one thing they're really scared of is if their competition becomes more data-driven and they don't, they do realize they're going to get left behind eventually. So I do believe slowly but surely the geeks are winning the day. The geeks shall inherit the earth. It ain't going to happen overnight, though. Can we go up front? Yeah, right over there.
Hi, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about where human analysis might come into play. There are some good examples of data-driven successes, like with the American Red Cross during Hurricane Sandy,
Sure.
where they used data, but they also used human analysis to really make that data help people.
Say a bit more about what you mean by human analysis in this case.
Evaluating the data and making sense of it so that you can make good decisions and decisions with integrity as well.
We need to be a little bit careful. Sometimes, as you say, analyzing the data, I hear second guessing the data. That's a bad approach. That's the classic hippo style of decision making. We know that if we let the hippo second guess the data, the decision quality is going to go down. If we find a way to take their talents and bake it into the analysis, then we're in pretty good shape. I heard an amazing story along these lines by a guy who was the head of analytics for the Obama 2012 campaign. So actually inside the campaign. And the huge organizational change that that campaign made was to not only bring in a bunch of like 20-something geeks, because all campaigns have those now, they listened to them. They put these guys high up and in the middle of the decision-making structure of a US presidential campaign, and they listened to them. And one story this guy told me was that they would calculate an optimal ad buy every day. You know, spend this much on your banner ads, do this much radio, do this much TV, based on our incredibly geeky model of what's going on. And he would take that ad buy to the people on the campaign who were responsible for calling up the radio station or the TV station and negotiating the deal, these media consultants. And at first, the media consultants would say, okay, aren't you cute, you little geek? Thank you for this printout. I'm going to take it into account when I think about the media buy. And what they had to do was train these guys to say, no, 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 no. This is the media buy. Your job is to go execute on it. Don't second guess it at all. But what they learned was once they got that done, that freed up many hours in the weeks of these media experts. And then what they could do is add value by negotiating like crazy people with the radio and the TV stations and whatnot, and hammering these guys to get a better deal. That's still a very human process, but we had to get the experts out of the business of trying to second guess the data. So I want to be very careful about the role of our alleged experts in a data-rich world. The instant we start talking about, human analysis on top of the data, I start to get really nervous about that. The evidence shows that doesn't work it degrades the quality. We got to be very careful. We have time for one more? No.
Last question.
Okay, we have a lot. It has to be short and it has to be really, really fantastic. We have 2 requirements for the last. Here we go. Leonard, it's time. We're not going to. Sir, don't let us down.
I'll try not to. What do we do in the organizations to ensure that the big equations that are used are in actual fact correct, even though the answers they give go against the gut of the people who are the experts?
So track them over time. If you say that this is the right media buy, does it lead to an uptick in positive perception of Obama in the subsequent weeks? In other words, don't take the geek's word for it. Track their results over time. Conduct an experiment, do an A/B test, watch it over time. The problem that a lot of us geeks have is a flavor of arrogance, where we say, oh, listen to you people who don't understand numbers as well, just listen to us and everything will be okay. That's a real flavor of arrogance. What we have to do is say, here's the test we're going to construct, here's how we're going to measure our success, our results, stay tuned, let's watch the track record going forward. It's not that hard to do. On the ground, it's very hard to get the mindset right to constantly evaluate yourself and check your own decision quality. Let me stop there. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Andrew. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Andrew. That was amazing. Thanks for being here this morning. What we'd like to do now is move into a break, and then we will be back in here for a customer panel. So let's be back in about 15 minutes so that we can start the panel on time at 10:40. So thank you very much.